all I can do is give a bit of an overview of the Act and a few of the areas that we see cropping up again and again in terms of being really increased risk areas for firms and changes where that may impact on current sort of anti-corruption policies and procedures. Now, I'm assuming that most of you have some familiarity with the Bribery Act, but for those of you who don't, and in a nutshell, we will be sweeping away the existing UK anti-corruption regime, which dates back to 1889, and replacing it with three principal sorts of offences. Firstly, offences of active and passive bribery, of paying bribes or receiving bribes, and by contrast to the US FCPA, those apply to both the public and the private sector, and as I said, to receipt as well as offering bribes. You then have a standalone offence of bribing a foreign public official. That's closely based on the OECD Convention and therefore, again, quite similar to the FCPA offence. And then the all-new offence, the corporate offence of failing to prevent bribery. And I'll come on to talk about that in more detail later because that's a real sea change for the UK regime. So that's the Bribery Act. As I say, I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 areas where it's particularly broad in scope and which give rise to practical difficulties in terms of drafting policies. And the first is the foreign public officials offence. Now, the key feature of this offence is that it applies where you offer or give an advantage of some sort to a foreign public official, which is pretty broadly defined, intending to influence that official and intending to obtain or retain business or a business advantage. Now, the key thing to note here is that by contrast to the main bribery offences, there's no need for you to be intending to act improperly or corruptly or dishonestly or any of those other sorts of intentions when you provide that advantage. It is sufficient to intend to influence and to intend to win business. And that gives rise to a significant impact on gifts and hospitality. I'm not going to deal with that in detail because I know Elizabeth's going to be talking about gifts and hospitality later. But just by way of example, almost any time you entertain public officials, you will often be doing so with a view at some stage to winning business and to gaining some sort of influence. So it becomes a difficult question as to where you draw the line between what is and what isn't permissible. And for that reason, although I've said that the Bribery Act applies to both the public and the private sector, the public sector remains an area of increased risk and therefore an area where companies really need to be looking at what their interaction with the public sector is, whether that's in terms of the public sector as a customer or indeed where you need sort of licenses or permits of some sort, and therefore you have interactions with the public sector in connection with those sorts of relationships. So that's the foreign public officials offence, and in any risk assessment one would expect there to be at least a focus on interactions with public officials for that reason. Secondly, the corporate offence. As I said, this applies where a corporate or a company or a partnership where a person providing services on that entity's behalf pays a bribe in order to win business for the company. Now, this is a sea change from the existing regime because at the moment, in order for a company to be guilty of bribery, it's normally the case that someone who's sufficiently senior within the company to be regarded as its directing mind and will, so normally sort of board level or immediately below, needs to have some level of involvement or awareness in the payment of the bribe. That's not the case under the corporate offence in the Bribery Act. It is there's no need for anyone senior within the company or indeed anyone within the company to have any knowledge of the bribe whatsoever. It is sufficient that someone performing services for the company, and that could be an agent or another representative, it could be a junior employee, pays a bribe in order to win business for the company. And the only defence to that new offence is that the company had in place adequate policies and procedures to seek to prevent that sort of conduct occurring. And that's the reason why, or one of the reasons why everyone is currently very focused on anti-corruption procedures, because they have gone from being a regulatory requirement under the FSA's interpretation of the CISC rules and something which is sort of good practice in any event, to being something which is effectively the company's only line of defence against committing a criminal offence. And adequate procedures in terms of what they are, there is a provision for the government to issue guidance. We were previously expecting that guidance over the course of the summer with a brief consultation period and then the offence being brought into force in October. Now, what I currently hear is that the government has effectively ripped up the existing draft of the guidance that was floating around and are starting from scratch from a blank piece of paper and asking civil servants for sort of new ideas as to what it's going to look like. So it may come out looking different from the existing guidance, which is probably a good thing because the existing draft was not terribly helpful. But at the moment, we have a bit of lack of clarity as to when that's going to be and what it's going to look like. And it may well be that the corporate offence is pushed into early next year in terms of being brought into force.